funny to be doing it online, but
Yes.
Good afternoon, sir.
good afternoon. Is Indranil and Manini there?
So Professor Mani has joined, waiting for Professor Indranil to join.
All right. Okay. So we've all seen the announcement, so I don't have to spend much time introducing you. But I have to say that I thoroughly enjoyed your thesis defense,
Thank you so much.
which I tuned in and listened to throughout. So I think that, so I was very interested in your findings and the whole discussion that we had around your thesis. So I wanted some of my colleagues to be able to hear you as well. So I think since we've got a decent number of the faculty joining, I might as well welcome you and hand it over to you to take care of the proceedings
Sure.
and give us your talk.
Absolutely. Let me just share my screen.
Dean Professor Indranil has also joined.
All right, good. I've done the preliminaries, so.
Yeah, I mean, good afternoon to everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Sudarshan, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research with all of you present here. Just to give a short introduction, so I am a PhD candidate in public policy at the Department of Public Policy and Policy Affairs of University of Massachusetts, Boston. I graduated, I defended my dissertation like just a couple of weeks ago, and I'd be graduating next month. And we're going to present today, like over the next 40 or 45 minutes, would be primarily focusing on the field work and the findings that came out of my dissertation research. So to talk about my project in a nutshell, the research assesses the mismatch between the welfare programs implemented by the government to respond to the needs of the urban poor and the actual demands of the poor communities living in slums and informal settlements, with a specific focus on housing needs. So the idea of this research project was to provide an alternative approach that could be helpful in identifying challenges in slums and ways to address them from the community's perspective using tools from decision sciences and operations research. So therefore, let me start the presentation by spending some time on the necessity of such a study. So it's not unknown, like most of us know by now, that over 1 billion people today live globally in slums and informal settlements that are unfit for human habitation. And among these, more than 150 million people, accounting to about 1/3 of India's urban population, live in slums and informal settlements. To address this concern, city governance systems have faced large-scale challenges to improve their access to adequate housing, sanitation, essential services, and security. Considering the importance of stable housing for the betterment of the lives of slum dwellers, the Government of India has undertaken multiple developmental approaches to provide housing and access to basic services for the urban poor. However, these approaches have not been able to achieve the desired results because they are primarily top-down in nature and do not address to the needs of the communities. These problems get all the more aggravated for the non-metropolitan cities of the country, which are hardly the focus and a focus of attention both for the administrators at the central and the state level, as well as for researchers, which in turn further leads to formulation of policies that do not reflect the needs of the communities. A combination of these factors lead to the creation of a mismatch between what the government provides to the slum communities through its programs and that of the slum resident needs. A primary reason why these government policies have failed to address the challenges in slums, excuse me, leading to the creation of such mismatches is because of the lack of understanding of slums in itself. So the challenges that slums face have many of these characteristics. First, slums are tough to describe as a policy problem. For example, there is inconclusive debate about conceptualizing slums as a place versus as a household's living condition. The other related misunderstanding is that the concentration of poverty is erroneously equated to that of a slum. Second, there is no single cause of slum formation and their growth. There are multiple causes cited in literature that includes extreme income inequality, rapid urbanization rates, lack of affordable housing supply, to name a few. Third, there are multiple stakeholders that are directly or indirectly related to this policy challenge, including the local, the state, and the national governments, the NGOs and the community-based organizations, slum dwellers, and non-slum residents living in the neighborhoods. And finally, a long history of failed policies clearly suggests that there is no right answer or say one answer to address these challenges so far. Considering the dynamic characteristics of slums, the understanding of slums have also largely ignored to capture the perspectives of the slum dwellers. Now, slums have been widely studied and analyzed using multiple disciplinary approaches and varied perspectives. So that include population estimations and enumerations using demographic surveys and censuses, or delineating slum boundaries and housing structures using satellite images, and even using simulations to test scenarios. However, barring ethnographic studies that focus on a particular intervention or a community, none of these approaches consider slum dwellers' perspectives as central to their inquiry and rarely treat them as context experts. Moreover, these approaches primarily rely on the aggregation of socioeconomic data that fails to capture the complexities of the lives of slum dwellers and their multi-tiered and interrelated connections within the society and the environment. The necessity of a transdisciplinary approach that could integrate the knowledge and methods from different domains was what I felt necessary to capture the realities in slum. So, keeping all of this in mind, taking a transdisciplinary approach that integrates knowledge from the fields of urban studies, operations research, decision analysis, cross-case analysis, and policy analysis. This research project assesses the mismatch between the welfare programs implemented by the government to respond to the needs of the urban poor and the actual demands of the poor communities living in slums. So I rely on three research questions to answer the purpose of this study. The first research question is an exploratory question addressed at an individual case level to study the mismatch as a function of the extent of the rigidity or flexibility present in currently implemented welfare programs and accounting to the extent of the constraints faced by the slum residents. The second research question is also an exploratory question, also studied at an individual case level to identify and analyze the varied nature of preferences and needs of slum communities for improvement in access to housing. The third research question follows a prescriptive orientation of inquiry by comparing and analyzing the listed preference of slum communities across all the case study slums and also between other stakeholder groups that include government officials and bureaucrats and NGO members that work in the slums. An analysis of these decisions across cases and across stakeholder groups provide feedback on the varied nature of preferences and the needs of the slum communities driven by multiple factors. In order to answer these research questions, I relied on the theoretical frameworks of subaltern theories of urbanism and urbanization, the government failure theory, and right to the city. First, the study located itself in the framework of two subaltern studies, subaltern urbanism and subaltern urbanization. Now, the lens of subaltern studies has been generally used to emphasize the importance of social power relations in defining oppressed groups, while subaltern urbanism highlights the need to recognize the spaces of poverty and provide accounts of slum as spaces of habitation and livelihood. Subaltern urbanization focuses on the importance to highlight the role of small cities in the urbanization process. So a combination of these worldviews allows us to focus specifically on slum communities in smaller cities. Within this frame, the theory of government failure elaborated the conditions in which the government is unable to provide or meet to the demands of the people, leading to unsatisfied demands of public service. Wolf identifies several constraints of government failure, which provides the framework to explain the extent of mismatch between government services and needs. So these constraints lead to the formulation of policies that do not reflect community needs. And such deprivations can minimize only when slum communities can express their concerns and have influence over the process of urbanization that best meets their needs. Highlighted through Harvey's right to the city approach, the study highlights the necessity for dwellers to have some form of shaping power over the process of urbanization through democratic control. So in order to contextualize this theoretical frameworks, my research was focused on three cities in Ganjam district in the city of Orisa: Brahmapur, Gopalpur, and Chhatrapur. So these cities were primarily selected to compare a mid-sized city of Brahmapur with two small towns of Gopalpur and Chhatrapur with a premise that multiple cases in a study can benefit from taking multiple forms. So the slums within these cities were carefully selected to observe the differences in preferences due to the implementation of the Odisha Land Rights to Slum Dwellers Act 2017. So in 2018, the state government of Odisha took a deviation from the regular path dependent programs by introducing this Odisha Land Rights to Slum Dwellers Act that offers tenure rights to all slum dwellers living in a city. The Act has two interlinked objectives: providing tenure security to slum dwellers against the threat of evictions, and creating a legal basis for improving the living conditions of slum dwellers. The Act also subsequently allows the beneficiary families to access the Government of India's flagship housing program, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, which gives grants up to 200,000, 2 lakh Indian rupees to build a permanent house. So this act got implemented at a time when primarily majority of the states have not been able to provide security of tenure to its slum dwellers in the face of political opposition and lobbying by private developers. The project in which the act is a part of has already been termed as the world's largest slum titling and upgrading program for the scale in which it is being implemented. The program was recently awarded in the World Habitat Awards of 2019. Thus, keeping the act as the policy perspective, the research project primarily interacts with two major stakeholder groups: slum residents and policy stakeholders who play a significant role in the design and implementation of slum development programs. So, talking of slum residents, the study is conducted at 4 slums in 3 cities: Raghupati Nagar and Dhimira Bauri Street in Brahmapur, which is the mid sized city, and Meta Sahi in Chhatrapur and Sai Baba Sahi in Gopalpur, which were the 2 small towns. Raghupati Nagar and Dhimira Bauri Street in Brahmapur were also selected for the difference in their location in the city, as well as because of the age of the slum. Furthermore, the slums in Brahmapur are compared to Sai Baba Sahi and Meta Sahi to observe the differences in preferences because of the variation in city size, and most importantly, to understand the effect of the implementation of the Odisha Land Rights Act. So the act is being currently implemented across all the urban areas of the state, except for the 5 municipal corporation cities that includes Brahmapur. Therefore, comparing the case study slums from Gopalpur and Chhatrapur, where the act has already been implemented, with slums from Brahmapur city provides a unique opportunity to observe how the priority of the communities change after the provision of land rights. So while many residents in Meta Sahi and Sai Baba Sahi were beneficiaries of the act and had already received tenure security, their counterparts in Brahmapur were not actually included in the current version of this act. In addition to the slum communities, the fieldwork also included interviews and focus group discussions with government officials at the state, district, and the city level, and civil society members that included local NGOs such as Youth for Social Development and large-scale NGOs such as Tata Trusts, which were involved in the act, as well as a few independent civic activists. Majority of the fieldwork was conducted with the assistance of this local NGO called Youth for Social Development, a grassroots organization involved with these communities. The NGO played a critical role in providing access to the slums, assisting in data collection, as well as member checks and validation of the findings. The fieldwork for this research project lasted approximately for around 8 months, starting from June 2019 to January 2020, where around 6 to 8 weeks was spent in each slum, with around 15 to 20 participants from each slum selected for interviews and focus group discussions. So that way, a total of 63 slum residents and 15 government officials and bureaucrats were interviewed during the fieldwork. The officials who were interviewed included senior bureaucrats from the Housing and Urban Development Department at the state level to junior engineers and fellows who were involved in the ground level implementation of the Odisha Land Rights Act. In addition to the interviews, a focus group discussion was conducted with the selected residents from each case study slum for validation of the information that was collected. An FGD was also conducted with members of YSD, the Youth for Social Development, the NGO, along with the few civic activists. So moving on to the methodology employed, as I had mentioned previously, traditional approaches to study slums have kind of been unsuccessful to capture the complexities in the lives of slum dwellers. So in contrast to these approaches, decision sciences offer a potential benefit of placing a greater emphasis on the assessment of problems and to give a greater orientation towards actual policy practice recommendations. So in particular, The study used the analytical approach of community-based operations research, which is well equipped to identify the concerns of vulnerable communities and solve problems within the public sector. The community-based operations research process, or CBOR, which I will call henceforth from now, consists of 4 logical steps based on conventional decision modeling: problem identification, formulation, solution, and implementation. The study uses 2 problem structuring methods from the field of decision sciences and operations research: strategic options development analysis, or SODA, which uses cognitive maps, and value focused thinking to implement each step of CBOR to identify the problems of the slum communities, structure their multiple objectives, and have a deep understanding of their values and motivations for a stable housing situation. So the first step of problem identification focused on observing how slum communities identify and formulate their problems. As I said, the problem structuring method of SODA was used for identifying the individual problems in each slum. So before any formal interactions, approximately a week was spent in each slum to observe the living conditions and to have informal discussions with the residents. After a week of those informal discussions, the next phase involved semi-structured interviews with the slum dwellers that aimed to explore the nature of problems and challenges faced by the communities. These challenges were aggregated to create a cognitive map where the issues are structured and connected with each other as causal pathways. Now, the cognitive maps were the basis to build value-focused thinking networks for each slum, which was the core component of problem formulation and the problem solution stages. So problem formulation aimed in deepening the understanding of the problem and linking the problems to action. So this was executed through an understanding of the overlying values and objectives of the slum communities using the method of value-focused thinking. So the use of VFT was also the basis of the next step of CBOR on problem solution, where the objectives were to identify and evaluate the impact of those different solutions identified by the communities. Over here, the participants were made to rank their preferred set of objectives at each level, which were then converted into weights using rank-based weighting methods. The next step after the calculation of weights was a cross-case analysis of the objectives and decision actions from the VFT networks of all the 4 case study slums, the government officials, and civil society to look for, excuse me, to look for broad patterns and similarities and differences across policy themes and cases. The final theme or the final step of problem identification was not a part or was not within the scope of this study to implement the identified solutions, primarily because many of those solutions required formal authorities such as those of the governments to implement them. However, the value structures and weighted hierarchies resulting from the exercise have the potential to become the basis for better policy design. So these aspects become much more clear as I present the findings from one case study, Raghupati Nagar. In the coming few slides, I will present the cognitive maps and the VFT networks that were built from the discussions with the Raghupati Nagar residents, and similar exercises were conducted for all the slums. So just to give a brief insight of this slum, Raghupati Nagar is located on the outskirts of Brahmapur city, as you can see in the upper left map in the slide. The settlement came into existence in the late 1990s. The community is built around an open sewage drain, as visible in the center image, and is occupied by approximately 72 households that suffer a lack of access to basic infrastructure facilities. The settlement is on government land, and the residents do not have any formal ownership documents. So the slum faced extensive damage in the 2013 super cyclone in Orissa, because of which the residents were selected for resettlement into a public housing project called Uttaramukhi, located 4 miles or 7 kilometers all the more further away from Raghupati Nagar. Though this made it this was so all the more outside the city's boundaries in the periphery. So 6 years after the introduction of this project, the households are primarily chosen to remain in their original location at Raghupati Nagar, while the completed public housing project remains mostly vacant. The community has been eagerly waiting for the implementation of the Odisha Land Rights Act, despite the fact that the act does not include municipal corporation cities like Brahmapur, where they were located. So as I had elaborated before, the first step of problem identification involved building a cognitive map on the challenges faced by the residents. So once the participants provided their inputs in the interviews, I identified action-oriented phrases that highlight a particular issue. let's take an example of a phrase, something like a slum built around an open drain. So these phrases were then aggregated to build a causal hierarchy network that connects the issues to its consequences in the form of a cognitive map, which overall presented a comprehensive understanding of the community's challenges as a whole. So in the case of Raghupati Nagar, the responses were categorized into two distinct themes based on the collected responses: challenges of the communities in the existing slum and challenges in the proposed resettlement housing. I understand that the image had to be constrained in the slide, so it might not be particularly visible. So let me focus on one aspect of the anticipated challenges to highlight how these issues in the cognitive maps were linked to each other. So, in the anticipated challenges, as an example, residents of Raghupati Nagar identified housing quality as a primary challenge in the public housing complex where they were due to be resettled. So, when further asked on what they meant by housing quality challenges, the responses focused on the apartments either being very small or the prospect of public housing being a multi-storied building. Further prompts made them identify factors such as lack of balcony or open spaces in the allotted flats, among other reasons why small apartments were an issue, or the prospect that senior citizens would have to climb, 3 to floors in a building that had no lifts or elevators. So, in such a way, such cognitive maps were built for all the four case study slums, and a discussion of these challenges visible in the cognitive maps form the basis for the next phase of CBOR, that is problem formulation, which involved framing of these values and objectives listed through hierarchy networks using the process of value focused thinking. So in this process, multiple prompts, transitions, and talking points guided the open-ended discussions, which involved asking the participants to identify the possible objectives of communities individually, while understanding their preferences to housing and essential services needs, and subsequently the possible alternative solutions to each of their objectives. So if the objectives are one of the most important reasons for interest in the situation, it was termed as a fundamental objective. And if the objective is important because it was an implication to some other purpose, it was called as a means ends objective. The means objectives are led to identification of potential solutions, identified or classified as decision actions. So the objectives were structured then to create this network, as you can see in the slide, which subsequently highlights the relationship of the fundamental objectives with other objectives and specify all the means to achieve the objective. This step becomes particularly useful to stimulate a thought about the range of solutions that may influence the achievement of a fundamental objective. So, continuing with the example of Raghupati Nagar, three primary fundamental objectives were identified by the residents to maximize the quality of residential life in the slum: the built environment, which focused on the slum's physical spaces; human services that emphasized on values essential to improve the residents' socioeconomic conditions; and social environment that aimed to improve the trust and transparency of residents in the local government and improve the community's social cohesion. So let me again take an example of objectives concerning the built environment to highlight how the objectives were elaborated to identify the possible solutions. So, as I had mentioned in the previous slide, the identification of fundamental objectives led to the defining and elaboration of the means and objectives, which highlight the means through which these fundamental objectives could be achieved by specific decision actions or solutions. So, in this case, when residents were requested on what they meant by built environment, the values that encapsulated built environment was ownership, permanency, and safety. So when further asked on what they meant by ownership, the responses involved either focusing on ownership of land or ownership on home. Then questions were asked on how they thought they could maximize ownership of land. So the responses that came or were identified as means were either by maximizing security of tenure or by minimizing resettlement. The final step was having them to brainstorm on the possible ways to achieve these means objectives that were highlighted in the form of decision actions. So for title security, some residents felt that title deeds could be provided in the actual slum area. Some were okay for title deeds to be provided in proximity, whereas for a few, the location did not matter as long as title deeds were provided. In such a way, solutions were identified for each and every objective that was identified by residents across all the slums. And once that was done, The use of this network, the VFT network, was also the basis for the next step of CBOR problem solution, where the objective was to identify and evaluate the impact of different solutions. So the residents were requested to rank their preferred set of objectives at each level. So for example, residents were made to rank from the three primary fundamental objectives on what they thought was the most preferred and the least preferred. So from there, they identified built environment as the most preferred objective and the social environment as the least from the three. So within built environment, then they identified permanence, so ownership as the most preferred objective and safety as the least preferred from the three. So this process went on and on until we got ranks on each decision action based on the based on the ranks of these objectives. And then these ranks were then converted into weights using rank-based weighting methods. So based on that, we were able to get this fancy table, which were identified the various decision actions along with their weights, and then which were classified or categorized into 8 policy relevant themes that were essential for the creation of the livable habitat of slum dwellers. So in the case of Raghupati Nagar, it was evident that the highest weighted decision action was increasing government support for construction of home, accounting to about 14% share of all the weights. Considering that majority of the slum dwellers were due to get evicted and resettled at a new location, they were not satisfied with the provisions at the resettlement housing. Therefore, it was expected that the decision actions that entailed the provision of a housing structure was the most crucial policy theme among others, aggregating to about 29% of the total share of weights. It was also worth observing that actions involving assistance to livelihood and providing basic infrastructure services only had a share of 12 and 10% respectively. These values could give support to the argument on how slum dwellers give priority to provision of permanent structure, and only once a permanent structure is available, access to basic services could be gained over time. So this way, 6 tables showing the list of decision actions from participants from all the 4 case study slums, the government officials, and the civil society members were created. The decision actions were further categorized with respect to the role of the government in the provision of the particular action. So the solutions were then differentiated based on the ones where the residents considered the government to be a direct provider versus those where the government could be a facilitator and have community organizations or residents take the lead for implementation. As observed in the table, residents consider an overwhelming 81% of the decision actions to be directly provided by the government. In contrast, the remaining 19% of the actions had the government to be a role of a facilitator. This proportion indicated the high expectations the residents of Raghupati Nagar had on the government to be a direct provider of all services. In addition, the decision actions were also categorized with respect to the expected timeline for implementation into the immediate actions and gradual actions as seen in the table. So the proportion of immediate decision actions had a marginally higher share of 52% as compared to those which could be implemented gradually and over an extended period. An understanding of the solutions identified by the residents across all the 4 case study slums, as well as the values from government officials and civil society members through a case study analysis of all the values, helped us to address the 3 research questions stated in the beginning of the presentation. So the first research question, if you remember, focused on understanding the specific extent and nature of mismatch between the government, the provision of housing, and the housing needs of slum dwellers. So over here, a common theme in community preferences across multiple slums was the underlying importance given to the aspect of tenure security. So in the case of Raghupati Nagar slum, which I discussed in my presentation, the residents wished for tenure security and desired to stay at their original location, whereas the government response was to relocate them into a resettlement public housing unit located further away from the city, which no one was interested to go. In the case of Dhimira Bauri slum, half of the residents were beneficiaries of a cash assistance program for housing construction over 10 years ago, after which the slum was considered as a developed slum in government records, and which made the residents ineligible for any future programs and development. While residents wished for improvement in basic infrastructure and financial support, the government believed that one-time financial assistance was enough, whereas the remaining residents who were not part of the program 10 years ago wished for tenure security while the government completely ignored their existence. In the case of Meta Sahi, few residents were provided title deeds under the Odisha Land Rights Act. While residents wished that all the entire community should receive tenure security, the government relied on strict implementation of the beneficiary selection criteria for the act, which ignored understanding of the local situation, and because of which there were many who were denied provision of title deeds under the Land Rights Act. And finally, at Sai Baba Sahi, where a large number of residents were constructing homes through PMAY after receiving the title deeds, residents wished that the government take a primary role in constructing the homes instead of leaving it on themselves, while the government officials believed that the cash assistance of 2 lakh rupees was enough and the residents should take an equal share in constructing their homes. The second research question focused on understanding the most preferred values of residents for housing, which was answered through the highest ranked decision action. So here it was evident that the priority of residents for the 4 slums, as well as the civil society members such as NGOs, was on tenure security and in situ provision and upgradation of housing. However, the highest ranked preferences of government officials was found to be increase in green areas of the city, which involved possible clearances and evictions of slum communities from the government land. The difference in the nature of preferences between the slum communities and the government officials also highlights the mismatch in the thought process between the stakeholder groups. It was also interesting to observe that the beneficiaries of the Land Rights Act in Meta Sahi of Chhatrapur and Sai Baba Sahi of Gopalpur, while content with receiving title deeds, were frustrated and worried about insufficiency of funds to complete the construction of their homes. So it is evident that the challenges for slum communities persisted at each and every step of their housing progression, from tenure security to housing provision and improvement in access to infrastructure facilities. It cannot be denied that the Odisha Land Rights Act 2017 and the subsequent construction grants through PMAY has been a boon to the thousands of slum families living in the small towns of the state. However, I found out in all of my 4 case study slums that provision of tenure security and limited funds to construct homes alone is insufficient to address all of their challenges. The third research question was to understand the variation in preferences across slum communities and different stakeholder groups. So this was addressed by a cross-case analysis that compared the decision actions of all the 4 slums, like from residents from all the 4 slums, the government officials and the civil society members to identify any unique solutions or actions. The cross-case analysis also helped in understanding the variation in preferences across groups and locations. Among the 8 forms of cross-case analysis I elaborate in my research, I take the example of one of those analyses that involved comparing or looking at the presence of the most occurring decision actions in each policy relevant themes with respect to the number of occurrences across slums and stakeholder groups. So provision of land rights to all the residents in the slum, construction of drains, and provision of community toilets were the 3 decision actions or solutions that was commonly identified by participants from all the 4 case study slums. So the focus on land rights reflect the importance given to tenure security by slum communities across all locations, irrespective of the implementation of the Land Rights Act, especially for slums in Brahmapur city where the act was not even implemented. Similarly, the needs for community toilets and drains in the slums highlight the importance for improving sanitation systems in urban areas. Most of the other decision actions were clustered either by city or whether the slums were beneficiaries of the Land Rights Act or not. However, none of these decision actions were identified as critical by government officials, a red flag in itself. Only 3 of the total of 155 unique solutions were common between the slum communities, the civil society members, and the government officials. The 3 common solutions were imposing fines and penalties to create awareness, improving the public distribution system for provision of subsidized rations, such as groceries, kerosene, or cylinders, and subsidizing public transportation for slum communities. The 3 actions focused on maximizing awareness and providing social infrastructure facilities. Improvement in public distribution system and public transportation would assist residents in their day-to-day sustenance. However, it was interesting to observe that all slum communities believed that imposing penalties and fines upon themselves was a good way to create awareness. They felt that the fear of being penalized would keep them accountable of their actions, especially those focusing on cleanliness and hygiene. The absence of a decision action common between the three stakeholders, especially on the provision of housing and the basic infrastructure, highlights the difference in thinking between the three groups, leading to the persistence of the housing mismatch in slums and the existence of preferences unique to slum communities. Therefore, we could clearly observe a trend where in most cases, the popular solutions among slum cases were not popular among other stakeholder groups, especially government agencies and vice versa. So from the findings, the research project identified three critical lessons for policymakers and bureaucrats. First, findings from all four case study slums clearly highlighted that housing needs are diverse and they range from the provision of physical structure to social amenities. The preferences of the slum communities that emerged out from these challenges were across multiple themes, from housing improvement to complaint redressal. So slum policies need to reflect the interconnected and complementary nature of housing aspects to create a livable habitat. It was also observed that the highest ranked alternatives were different among all the four case study slums. The diverse priorities highlight the necessity for incorporating programs that address the diverse needs of communities at the same time. Second, it was evident on multiple occasions that all slum residents expected equality while receiving policy benefits across slums. The residents who were not covered under the Land Rights Act demanded land rights certificates not only for tenure security, but also for equality of rights. In Raghupati Nagar, which I talked about extensively, residents wanted tenure security at their original location and not resettle into the public housing complex. In Meta Sahi and Sai Baba Sahi, where the Land Rights Act were provided, the families who were denied tenure security were often the poorest of the poor and insisted that they would be treated equally and are provided with the land titles just like any other residents in the community. And third, it was clear that the perceived housing needs were incremental in nature. For instance, residents of Raghupati Nagar and few residents of the Mirabauri, Meta Sahi, and Sai Baba Sahi residents demanded land titles, only which would be the basis for further housing improvements. Whereas in those communities who had already received land titles, they sought to focus on construction of permanent structures in their land parcels. However, it should be noted that all needs are not incremental in nature. The findings clearly indicated that access to basic infrastructure services such as water, sanitation, and drainage was demanded by all residents, regardless of the legal status and physical conditions of the houses. Coming to the significance of the study, the primary significance was to highlight the voices of the slum dwellers, to show the urgent need of incorporating community participation in the policymaking process of affordable housing programs. The study recognizes the community voices, which would be an essential block for such participatory policies. Second, these tools can act as a field guide for practitioners such as NGOs and slum community-based organizations to implement CBOR methods on the ground. While academicians have been advocating for participatory research methods to implement developmental approaches that focus on slum communities, it is often difficult for many NGOs since they do not have the adequate technical knowledge and training about these methods. The research project hopes to have a lasting social change that could lead to the design of slum welfare policies with the inputs of the slum communities at the forefront, and with NGOs and CBOs playing the role of a facilitator to bridge the technical barrier between slum communities and policymakers. Third, the research project is a transdisciplinary project that integrates urban studies, methods from decision sciences, cross-case analysis, and policy analysis. Integration of different theoretical and methodological frameworks allows a thorough understanding of the challenges of slums critically and provides a new lens to observe the problems prevalent in slums for a long time. And finally, the study contributes to the literature of operations research by using problem structuring methods such as SODA and VFT in a completely novel context to understand the lives of slum dwellers in India. VFT is traditionally used in the field of operations research and management sciences to study the decision-making strategies of organizations. So this way, the research project also contributes to the growing trend of OR methods to understand the needs of marginalized and vulnerable communities. The research also contributes to the existing slum literature by innovatively studying the problems of slums from a decision sciences perspective. While the study had some large-scale significance, there were some limitations to the study which had to be addressed. First, the mismatch between the housing needs and the government provisions in slums is highly context dependent. In fact, generalizing is against the spirit of the approach that I have advocated. to recognize the diversity of the needs and preferences upfront and questioning the one-size-fits-all ethos prevalent in our current policy-making processes. Instead, I urge to use the framework proposed here to identify such diverse needs and preferences that must be present in thousands of slums across the country. In that sense, the study sets the path to use the framework of CVOR and methods such as VFT to highlight the variation in challenges and trade-offs that exist in each individual slum that would have a story of its own and demand local solutions. Since this was one of the first studies to apply VFT and other problem structuring methods in the context of Indian slums, implementing these methods in a new setting provided many challenges that required creative adaptation of standard frameworks. First, the use of VFT, as I had said, has been traditionally applied to professionals and heads of organizations considered as domain experts in their fields. These participants generally assist the researcher in the creation of these networks during the fieldwork. However, many of the participants in my study lacked the ability to read or write. Therefore, I had to take precautions to ensure that the slum dweller's voice was represented accurately in the maps and network diagrams. For increasing the validity of such representations, I asked NGO volunteers to be present during the VFT sessions and requested them to review the network diagrams to ensure that I did not miss or misrepresent the perceptions of the slum dwellers in the construction of these networks. And finally, the most significant unforeseeable limitation of this research project was the COVID-19 pandemic. Fortunately, a majority of the data collection through interviews and FGDs were completed by January 2020, just before the pandemic and the accompanying restrictions. I had initially planned to visit all the case study slums sometime again in May or June of 2020 to complete the analysis and have a discussion between a select slum residents, NGO staff members, and a few government officials to observe the responses of the government over the preferences listed by the slum communities and identify any middle ground between the stakeholders for implementation. However, the mandatory lockdowns that were enforced from March to July made any travel and contacts with the community impossible. Also, it was against the research ethics because in-person interactions would have posed a risk to the health and safety of the participants and myself. So I was subsequently also informed by the NGO that many slum residents, including participants of the study, had left the slums and went back to their native villages due to the lack of livelihood opportunities in urban areas. Therefore, it became impossible to contact any of my previous participants, and at the same time was also unethical to ask for the time from government officials when they were overly occupied with the responsibility of managing a public health emergency in a country. Under such conditions, it was finally decided to suspend all remaining fieldwork after the discussion with the dissertation committee, and therefore the research project relied on member checks and validation with few civil society members who were willing to engage in limited number of online discussions to create those hierarchy networks. So while this study is just the first step, it is expected that the research project findings will inform government agencies and NGOs that work in the slum communities to design and implement appropriate interventions. In this sense, the study devises a technical solution in the form of a bottom-up policy support tool and techniques that complement the current top-down practices of providing housing and infrastructure services. Such an exercise could also be a basis for designing government welfare programs in the future that are reflective of the community's needs. The framework and the use of problem structuring methods do not limit to the provision of housing for slum communities and can be expanded to multiple domains and services such as education, healthcare, and livelihood, among others anchored in slums. For example, VFT can be used to identify the type of livelihood skills preferred by various residents in a particular community, which in turn could be used by the urban local body to decide the kind of skill training to be provided to the communities. The framework also does not limit to the use of SODA and VFT as in this study and can employ multiple problem structuring methods based on the scenario. And finally, as it is not possible to study all the slums around the country in a timely fashion at an individual level, it makes greater sense of scaling the effort by providing the tool in the hands of the people who routinely do this job, such as NGOs and practitioners who engage with the communities routinely. A toolkit and training modules could be a natural extension of this work in the future for NGOs and research organizations to collect, analyze, and integrate needs and preferences into the policymaking process. So with this, I end my presentation, and I thought of summarizing the key arguments of my project in this slide. And with here, I open the virtual session up for questions, for any questions, any discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Namesh.
Thank you, Professor Darshan.
That was very interesting.
Thank you.
And so we'll have a round of a discussion on what you said. But one of the things I have to say straight away is we, in a public policy school such as ours,
yes,
we are concerned about equipping students with ways by which they can bring the public into the making of public policy.
Yes.
Because your narrative is really that policies get made mostly by public officials, bureaucrats, who mean well and think that they've got, they are doing what is best for the people.
Yes, yes.
So this is, and that's a long history of this assumption on the part of public bureaucrats to think that, by definition, whatever they do is in the public interest.
Yes.
Without actually verifying whether the relevant public thinks the same way.
Yes.
And what you've shown is that there are significant differences between the way government officials think is what's in the best interest and what the people concerned also think, and there are ways of discovering what it is. So the methods you used and the idea of producing a kind of a manual that we could encourage people involved in any activity, whether it's in health or education,
Absolutely.
to try and figure out what is it that the public actually thinks and wants is extremely valuable. So I want to compliment you on that and a very, very clear presentation of how you went about doing this. That said, I want to ask you a more general question.
Sure.
Because you started off with Orisa's decision to give title to slum dwellers. Now, this is something on the basis of which Hernando de Soto became a very famous person.
Yes.
He wrote about this as the other path.
Yes.
We're thinking of Sendero Luminoso, the terrorist groups in Peru. We are now concerned about extremist groups in central India, and so De Soto's solution was, in all these informal settlements and squatter communities, give them title and their life would get transformed. But over time, and it had many takers, I think even the Planning Commission at one point invited him, and then found that his team was much too expensive. They were going to do a kind of a needs assessment of the public, relevant publics, and recommend and so on. And they were charging outrageous fees. And so the Planning Commission didn't proceed with De Soto, but some other countries which got support from donor countries like Tanzania got support from Norway. They went ahead, Albania did it. And the outcome is not a very happy one in any situations. Thailand also tried to do it. They used aerial surveys to plot land and so on, and expensive operations, and they came to naught. So I'm wondering what's different about the Orisa thing. Is it motivated by ideas similar to that De Soto argued as the sort of the mystery of capital, the land asset being capital that can lead to credits and whatever. Okay, so that's a more general one. And what is Orisa? How is it different in that way. I mean, from what DeSoto has been recommending to many countries.
Sure, and thank you so much for your question. To give a direct response to how the Odisha Land Rights Act was formulated, I think you are correct, and by saying that yes, it does follow DeSoto's primary arguments in terms of, and with a belief that yes, provision of title deeds would lead to opening up of other doors for the communities based on which they can have an upward mobility and have development across other services. I think the one thing the Orissa government did as compared to previous programs was include that as a part of the livelihood, as part of an overall livelihood development program, when they called it as the Odisha Livelihood and Housing Habitat Mission, if I'm not wrong. And where what they said was after the provision of land titles, they said that in the due course of time, they would also focus on provision of infrastructure services and provision and securing livelihood and like sources of livelihood in the very communities where title deeds are provided. So this was something which was new and that was not covered under previous and like under previous like title provision acts. And I think that is one reason why where people have been kind of very optimistic on how the Odisha Land Rights Act is going to look further. But again, with like based on my research when I went into the field, it was kind of interesting to observe that although the government did promise that they would be providing infrastructure services and providing access to livelihood in the long run, but the residents themselves had no idea about it. So there was again a communication gap in terms of what all the residents thought they could be receiving from the government. So that way there was a lot of like complaints and a lot of like dissatisfaction in terms of how infrastructure services were not provided on time. In fact, in one of the slums where I went, I remember this case where the residents had to buy water cans for just for the construction of their homes and had to pay 50 rupees for a 10-liter jar because water was so scarce. And the entire time there were actually many residents who were even thinking of just stopping the construction work and going and resettling to some other slum. So these are the kind of challenges at the ground level which I felt the government failed to realize and was not able to accept that something like that was happening.
Right, thank you. I, but you haven't answered my question about what is your overall appraisal of the DeSoto enterprise.
Uh, I firmly believe that I think just provision of land titles does not lead to like how should I say, like does not give a magical solution for the improvement in the lives of slum communities. I mean, there has been a completely other school of thought like led by scholars such as Gilbert, who have been very vocal about like DeSoto's provision of land titles, where he an entire school of thought says that like provision of land titles does not necessarily lead to like further development and like further development of housing and upward mobility. And he is like proof, and actually there's an entire set of studies where he shows like based on the very countries, I think including Tanzania, where he found out that after provision of titles, it was not necessary that residents were able to have an upward mobility and improvement in their lives. So even I firmly believe that other development has to be a part and parcel of it.
Thanks. Now I have Indranil and then
Sure.
Subhashish with their hands up. Mani, you keep
Sure,
a
sir.
tab on who's wanting to make an intervention. So Indranil,
Right.
go ahead.
Thanks, Professor Sudarshan. A special thanks to Nimesh because I was very fascinated by your presentation and
Thank you so
was
much.
thinking about the implications, And I don't have much question to ask, but one quick, probably some sort of reaction to facilitate the discussion. Currently, Delhi and NCR region, uh, the plans are being formulated.
Yes.
And in Delhi, it's already the draft would come anytime soon. And then eventually, probably with a window of 3-4 months, there it would be finalized. And our experience have been engaging with the master plans had been that once the plan is approved, some of the provisions of the plans are violated so much, and and new things come up and a lot of the avenues are left for interpretation so that they can be used for specific purposes. And
Yes.
there I feel, some of the methods you have suggested, or, like in the formulation of plans, and also through this creating do you think this kind of a process can create a set of accountability mechanism also, like set forth an accountability mechanism so that people can have greater control over some of these larger policy issues which affect their use of their status in the city and their use of public amenities and public places in the city. I personally thought it could have a lot of implication. Studies like this could have implications on similar processes. So your reflection and thoughts on this, or if such exercises have been taken up in other countries where we can learn from. Because personally, we are engaging with the process of master plan, and probably it might be interesting for us to learn from such experiences and see if we can somewhere contribute.
No, I mean, thank you so much for such a wonderful insight. And to be really honest and frank with all of you, the idea for this project actually came while being a part of a set of meetings that the Boston Development Agency authorities were having for their land use development for 2040. And in some of their meetings, they actually use methods like these, not these exact methods, but from the same domain, in order to involve all stakeholders from different groups, and that included groups from different races, from different financial, from different areas, to ensure that there was a lot of diversity with respect to the voices of different stakeholders. And from there, what ensured that these networks, or like these hierarchies as an example, created a basis for them, as you said exactly, as a basis for accountability as well in the long run, where not only did it ensure that all the inputs from different stakeholder groups were recorded and there for up for the being, but at the same time, through subsequent intervals and meetings, they were also able to make sure that they were identifying each particular objective at a time. So it was basically from those discussions that I got the idea that if something like that is done for involving all stakeholder groups, it makes more sense to have that specifically when we focus on vulnerable communities such as slum dwellers, who often are not even given the chance to be a part of such policy making process. And by this, it not only ensures that you're actually giving a seat in the table for them to exercise their concerns, but this entire process is also happening in a structured way, which gives directives for government organizations or any think tanks to identify proper decisions on what can be done. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, thanks. Absolutely. Professor Sudarshan, can I ask one more question?
Yeah, you have the
Fine.
floor.
Okay, thanks. No, so do you think your framework can also somewhere integrate the political economy aspects of urban development or urbanization? You talked about subalternism,
Yes.
and somewhere we like our experience have been, or maybe because of my personal bias towards looking things from that political economic framework. That such concerns become very dominating in
Yes.
even policy formulation. So can somewhere these like can we build political economy into it or incorporate some of the political economy considerations?
This is a great suggestion. I mean, to be really honest, in an ideal world, I think this is how I would want the framework to be used in the long run. And in fact, even what I've been trying to do since the past 1 year is partner with local NGOs again in the state of Orissa to use this toolkit in their own work and to see if they can integrate government officials into the same set of these meetings to create these networks. But as you said, these differences on views across groups always plays a major role. And we've already had instances in a couple of pilot studies where often slum dwellers are not very comfortable to speak in front of politicians with the fear that they might get reprimanded in the long term, or at the same time our government officials trying to take an upper tone and authority talking. So these are the kind of narratives that we've been trying to see on how we can manage in the long run, like maybe using like separate interviews, or like just kind of like using, I would say, like the way we took at like Lego sets example, like just looking different ways how we can arrange and make sure that these voices can be incorporated, and at the end have it as a network. But then yes, I do accept that it is a challenge to integrate the voices of different groups at the same time, especially when you have there a lot of political motivation behind it.
Thank you. Subhashish.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I mean, to be able to compress all of that into those slides it's quite cool. Well done. So please take my questions in the spirit of sort of, I'm assuming this is going to become a book project, or I mean, it's clearly something. So sort of trying to sort of open up the horizons, and already Professor Indranil already raised this issue of political economy.
Yes.
And I'm trying to sort of try to say a little bit more about that. So this method that you're calling CBOR.
Yes.
I mean, this approach is used. So you're in a public policy department, right?
Yes. Yes.
So this is also used in other fields, but there are different names to this. So for example, in communications and new media, there is a school of research, they call it Culture-Centric Approach, CCA. It's pioneered by this scholar called Mohan Datta, who teaches at Massey University. Now, one thing I can say straight away is what you're doing is much, much more rigorous. I can say all this because I've actually done, I have a paper with Mohan Datta in critical Asian studies where we're doing something like this. Now, one thing I can say is your approach is way, way more rigorous than what I have seen. So, I mean, so I have to put that up front, that this is it's a very, very rigorous way of doing this. So that's wonderful. But so one of the things I noticed is that with these sorts of approaches, so your conclusion that that the voices of the project, the sort of the receivers are not heard in government policy making. I mean, this particular approach that you take, I mean, that should not be surprising, right? Because that is precisely what this approach is meant to uncover. Right? That's what's good about these approaches. They will almost by definition, you will pick this up, right? But as I said, I mean, so it's not exactly the mismatch, but it's the way you've documented the mismatch, which I think is
the primary focus.
I think you should highlight that it's not just identifying mismatches. It's the way you've done this, the way you have mapped the mismatches and so on. So that's one point. Just to sort of project your work much more broadly. I think you can say much more than, well, this is just mismatch. I mean, there's a lot more that's going on. Now, the second question is about politics, and you have you've already answered part of it by saying that well, these questions are difficult to raise, and there's sensitivity about local political contexts. Now, this is a good, this is a doable answer, but then you see there is, and because you started off with this whole subaltern studies background, the problem is there is work by, for example, there is work by Partha Chatterjee, for example.
Yes.
He has a book called The Politics of the Governed.
Yes.
And what does he do in The Politics of Governed? He goes to slums. Okay, right, and he's talking to people in the slums, again, not as systematically as you are, and he actually sort of, he offers what is interesting about his work. He doesn't have your methodological rigor, but then he's able to tell us something about the politics within the slums that leads to good or bad outcomes. So, for example, in some slums, he observes that some slum dwellers are able to exercise what he calls moral pressure.
Yes.
And using moral pressure, they're able to sort of create some sort of a convergence, a synergy between their preferences and the preferences of government officials. Now, this doesn't happen all the time. It works in some places and not in others. So that is something I'd like you to, if I know you were not able to sort of, I mean, you made, your comment was about research design issues, but I'd still like you to sort of tell us a little bit more about what why do you think there was this sort of failure in this? Why is there so much absence of synergy? Why aren't communities able to exert pressure through political brokers, through the political party process? Just your observations. I know you do. I mean, obviously, you can't. This is not something you investigated systematically, but I'd like to know a little bit more about that aspect. And similarly, on the side of the government officials, like what explains their inability to grasp these? Is it again, here you can again connect your work to, for example, P. Sainath has that famous book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought. So he says things like, about high development, high culture, low culture. Government officials are trained in a particular way, but that book was written so long ago. So the question is, don't they learn that, that all these ideas that they have, these big master plans, will lead to sort of implementation failure? So I'm really curious about the why aspect of it. But first of all, again, as I said, the documentation is excellent. I'm just asking you to sort of reflect a little bit more about the big, the why aspects.
Yes.
Namesh, I suggest that you make a note.
Yes, I was just doing that.
What Subhashish expects, so that we'll collect a range of comments and questions perhaps, and you can come back and have the last word touching upon all of these. Melindo had indicated he had a comment or question, and then Shreyashri has a hand up.
So, it was an excellent presentation and very well sort of thought out structure to put diverse ideas into one skeletal perspective. And from that perspective, so far as research for PhD is concerned, if we consider that research for PhD is different from research for the rest of the life, then if you consider it as a research for PhD, it has been an excellent sort of an effort, and you have been able to do justice to what was expected of you. I was just raising some questions which may give you some food for thought to go into research for your lifetime. So beyond PhD as to how to go about it. As per my understanding of the whole issue of rural to urban migration goes, and I also assume here that most of the slums that you are talking about, and it was ultimately confirmed at the end of your presentation, that most of the slums are results of rural to urban migration. And this whole idea of rural to urban migration was raised in a very seminal paper by W. Arthur Lewis, who went into an understanding as to why should there be a facilitation of the process of rural to urban migration, because they will move from a subsistence wage earning system to a modern sector where they will be earning wages according to their productivity, and the difference between the subsistence wage and the modern wage according to productivity will be higher, and they will be ultimately absorbed into the modern system, and development in the two-sector economy will happen in a better way. But whatever I could gather from your presentation, it appears that fundamentally that this so-called drastic improvement in livelihood by shifting from a rural habitat to an urban habitat did not really happen. And that was proved, but rather substantiated, when you argued that many of them went back to their rural hinterland during the period of COVID. That is indicator good enough to say that it did not happen. So from that perspective, I have a question to ask you. You mentioned repeatedly about state failure. Do you think that it is also a very prominent case of market failure, that market did not provide them good enough wage as was expected from the literature, that this sort of a situation evolved? This is what I think you may like to look into while you are enlarging your understanding, and you may also throw some light on it. I have a number of questions, but I won't go into all of them. I found one observation in your valuation of the preferences and their distribution between CSOs, communities, and the government bureaucracy. I may be wrong, but because I just had a very short glance at the table, I could not do the mathematics or arithmetic correctly. But does it reflect that there is more matching in terms of the preference between the CSOs and the bureaucracy than the preference between the CSOs and the communities? Meaning, are the CSOs observed to be more matching with the preferences of the bureaucracy? This is a question that you may be able to give some idea on this question.
I'm so sorry. So I'm so sorry, Toli. Can you just give me a second? I think my pen stopped working. Let me just get a new pen. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, Milindo. I found that the civil society organizations that deal with,
yes. I'm so sorry. Yes.
The observation is,
broader perspective.
The
organizations, they end up, wanting to change the bureaucracy, but then become clones of the bureaucrats over a period of time. I mean, so
yes, that is what I found out. That is very interesting, because this is something we hardly get in the literature, and you may like to pursue it further as to why. Because it reminds me of a very interesting experiment that followed in Orisa itself. There was a Chilika Batao movement, and there were some case studies, and I also did a case study on that. And one of the fundamental results of the Chilika Batao movement, as we found, was that some of the leaders turned into MPs in the future. Right. So the matching of preferences between CSOs and bureaucracy is found to be much more relevant and much more prominent in the context. And that's why maybe, if possible, if you can, I find out whether the CBOs have a different sets of preferences and whether that can be brought into the picture. And finally, the question was raised and the issues were discussed in detail, so I'm not going into further detail of it, but I'll just like to flag it that there was a very important theoretical argument by Kenneth Arrow called the Impossibility Theorem.
Yes.
And Impossibility Theorem argues that it is very difficult to rationalize the preferences of three different individuals into one acceptable voting pattern.
Yes.
So I feel that also comes out very clearly from your observation. Absolutely. And you can go a little bit beyond what you have said over here.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
thank you very much for your observation.
Thank you.
Some wag observed that NGO means next government official.
I actually do have some observations from my study based on
but let's keep a note of it, and I'm going to ask Shresh to come in.
Thank you. Hi, Namesh. It was an excellent presentation.
Thank you
so much.
Shresh. Can you turn on your video?
Yeah.
Good.
Hi, Namesh. I think really enjoyed listening to your presentation, and just a couple of thoughts. I don't even know if this is a question, but kind of thinking aloud what was going on in my mind listening to your presentation and some of your slides. I think I was also reflecting on the role of the NGOs and, how they played a role as a facilitator in the process, how you did your field work, also to kind of take their help and do those conversations, check the decision making, the rankings, etc. And looking at some of the literature, especially in the case of Mumbai, and where they looked at the role of Spark for the World Bank implementation project, and there's been a lot of discussions around how do we look at the roles of NGOs and CPOs, like even Professor Sudarshan and Professor Melinda was pointing out, in terms of understanding some of the power dynamics that even they has, when they are doing these facilitation process. And so that is, of course, of what's happening, on the ground, but also on a more analytical sort of understanding what happens when these roles are shifting, right? So when you say that, these are stuff from the voices of individuals, how many individuals from the CPOs or NGOs were also part of the community? At what point do their roles change eventually? Like Professor Sudarshan pointed out, if some of them are going to the governments or fighting as like political leaders. So even fixing this understanding of what is the citizen's perspective, it did remind me of what Shubhashish was trying to say on Partha Chatterjee's point about, the civil society and the political society. So kind of, thinking aloud on those analytical lines about what happens when those roles shifts, because none of this seems to be very static in nature as we understand, absolutely. Right? Like all of this are so interlinked and fluid. So when we look at some of the rankings that you have done, like how do we keep that fluidity and that transitoriness in mind while thinking about some of these questions? I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, this is a great insight.
Is there anybody else who has a comment or question? Otherwise, we'll leave the last 10 minutes to Namesh to address comments made and wind up on time. Go ahead, Namesh.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you so much, like all of you, for your wonderful insights. And I'll start with Subhashish. I mean, thank you so much for the insights on culture-centered approach. I will definitely start going through this and see like what's in these both the approaches come. And yes, I do agree the need to focus more on the process of mapping the mismatch than the actual mismatch. I mean, this is something that I've been discussing with my own advisors, that while I had started this dissertation with the purpose of just looking at the extent of mismatch, but we didn't realize the nature of the process and how extensive it got, and the kind of like the outputs that made it more important to highlight the process and the ways we could actually get the responses. And yes, like this is something that I have been looking on myself. With respect to your talk about politics and identifying the synergy between slum dwellers and government officials. So I can again talk about from my own experiences in this research. It was always interesting to see that clear difference with respect to how government officials who were directly involved with the communities at the grassroots level, like how those responses were very different to that of bureaucrats and IS officers at the state level. So for example, I remember having interviews with IS officers or with even housing secretaries who would not accept to believe whatever I would say from my findings on the ground. And there was even one who called me a communist because I said that the Land Rights Act was not working well at the grassroots level. But at the same time, there were instances where, like, especially junior engineers at the municipal corporations or those at the urban local bodies were much more empathetic to that of the realities of the challenges. And they would be kind of appreciate, like while they would kind of try to see if there could be a place where they could kind of adjust or like see kind of try to cut corners in terms of providing those developments. But at least in that way, they were at least cognizant of the fact that yes, such challenges like the diversity in those challenges exists. And it is important to kind of look at those when you're thinking of providing any kind of developmental provisions. And I think like that is one big difference that I found, like even with respect to like the higher I got in with respect to talking with bureaucrats like the district collectors or the commissioners, I could see that huge disconnect with the realities where in many cases they would talk about like, oh, like we'll make our city beautiful, we make it all green, and we'll make sure that evictions like we'll make sure that all the services are provided. And kaise provide karenge? Oh, we have like 6 Rajiv Awas Yojana projects working in the like different construction going on, so we'll make sure that they'll go there and have a happy life. But they would not be cognizant of the fact that even as of now, more than 80% of those projects in the same city are unoccupied because residents are not interested to go there. So such kind of disconnects did exist. And coming to the, I'll try to even connect to what Professor Milindo was saying about the role of CBOs in the same point. Again, with respect to CBOs, it was interesting to see what kind of role those NGOs and like those organizations had with respect to their association with the government. So the NGO that I was saying about, with facilitated in my fieldwork, like Youth for Social Development, had been working with the communities for over 20 years, and they had been kind of a mediators to the state, to the urban local bodies in exercising their concerns. So that way, again, they were way more empathetic and had a better idea of what they wanted to say, which kind of reciprocated the concerns of the slum dwellers. And at the same time, when I had interactions with large NGOs like Tata Trusts and Janagraha, which were actually hired by the state government of Orisa itself to ensure the proper development or the implementation of these programs. In certain ways, it was again interesting to see how they would again give kind of a turn, I won't say a complete blind eye, but at the same time, their primary focus was to ensure the implementation of the project than to actually see what was the outcome of the implementation, if that made sense. And that was clearly visible when in many cases, like people, especially from those NGOs, focused more on getting work done. Like we have 50,000 titles provided in the last 6 months, or we want to make sure that this many people will be done, not actually looking at the reasons on why was it that this many people are excluded, but just looking at the people who were included. Some examples such as those. And that was clearly reflected again when I started talking to CBOs and civic activists who were working directly with the slums, where their focus was like, okay, jinko mil raha hai, they are getting it, well and good, but let's focus on the people who are not getting it. And why is it that they are being even excluded from the entire narrative? So these were the kind of like points or like solutions or decision actions that I could say, like clearly that diversified with respect to the different levels of NGOs that I was interacting with. And finally, with respect to like Shreyashi, like your point about fluidity of the ranks, I mean, to be really honest, I think thank you for such a wonderful insight. I mean, I do agree that this is something which would be applicable in the long run, as like whenever we are talking to individuals and their objectives, like with respect to people who change over time, like even their perspectives would differ. And it becomes very important how we make sure that there is a process that kind of reciprocates that differences of the perspectives. So, I mean, the way we had initially planned, so one of the projects that I was saying that I was working with a local NGO was to use these networks across all the 170 slums in the city of Brahmapur and kind of see if we can find any common grounds that could be shared with the government officials. But again, now that we think about it, in the last 1 year, with the impact of COVID, for example, and again, talking of the impact of migration, as Professor Milindo was saying, to consider that half of the residents do not exist in the slums and others are there for very different reasons. So obviously, even their preferences would have changed a lot with respect to the externalities, such as a pandemic. So I think it is important to take care of it. And I guess I would have to think of ways how we could like ensure that such fluidity is taken care of. And with respect to the last point of the impossibility theorem raised by Professor Milindo, I think this was something which even I had a discussion with my advisors about how do we make sure that like when we are identifying solutions from different stakeholders, how do we make sure that we try to bring about that one statement which we think that captures the essentialities of all the stakeholders involved. And it was, I mean, like that's what the impossibility theorem was about. So that was the place where we thought of coming to the idea of coming to the middle ground, of coming to the place where what we do is we bring about the needs of the preferences. So let's say like the most top 5 preferred set of solutions by the slum communities. And then we compare that to that of those brought forward by the government officials, as well as those brought by the CBOs. And then you have a discussion within all the stakeholder groups, where that is where they kind of try to come on a middle ground, where all groups have certain set of negotiations and adjustments. So that was some place where we thought could be possible, where we could negate such an effect and see that all the groups are kind of happy with what is coming out of it.
Namesh, thank you. Sure. I saw Sonali had raised her hand.
Yeah, no, actually, I think absolutely at the end, Namesh, it was a wonderful talk. Just come here because it was very interesting, looking at it from so many, but I just wanted, just to give you another, not another really, but, there's an, in bargaining, if I look at the NGO as an intermediary in a bargaining process, if I look at it in that way, there is a paper, which, it just kind of does an experimental study of the bargaining process between a buyer and seller. They're just buying and selling one good, and there is an intermediary. And this paper actually examines how this intermediary affects the prices and the likelihood of a successful negotiation. And actually the results of that paper show that the intermediary, whether informed or not, it reduces the likelihood of an agreement and increases the time to reach an agreement. So, looking, they're very, just I thought I could, flag this too. Like an intermediary sometimes, doesn't help the cause. If I could look at the NGO in that way. That's all. It was a wonderful talk, Namesh. It was really nice.
Thank you. This is such an interesting perspective.
Thank you, Sonali. I don't know whether you want to go and explain this to the farmers who have blocked the highway about the Arhatiyas who are intermediaries, whom they value. No, it's been fascinating. I'll leave it to Manini and Indranil, who took the initiative to invite you, Namesh, to thank you, one or both of them. And I also thank Deepanshu, who joined. He's not in the public policy school, he's in the liberal arts and humanities school. But he's been working on, with the subaltern communities, so to speak. Indranil?
Okay. Manini, would you like to go ahead? I can.
Manini, yes.
Thank you, Namesh. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and coming here and giving this wonderful talk. I agree with everyone. Your presentation was very structured, extremely clear, and I think all of us enjoyed it a lot. And thank you so much to everybody who's here to attend this talk. This invitation, Indranil and I actually reached, we reached out to you because we also want to have a little bit of a discussion with you